Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Elena with Napa Bookmine. I am thrilled to be joined tonight with by our authors. Sorry, I'm trying to read and speak at the same time. George Oxford Miller, a longtime environmental photojournalist, writer, and botanist, who has been a long-distance member of the California Native Plant Society for years. That is the San Diego chapter, I believe. Let me see if I have that right. I think I do. And now, of course, is president or was president of the Albuquerque chapter of the New Mexico Native Plant Society for 9 years. George's book, which many of you have already bought, which is amazing, thank you so much, is Native Plant Gardening for Birds, Bees, and Butterflies, Northern California. He also has a Southern California edition, in case any of you are joining us from there or have friends in Southern California that you want to recommend this book to. George's other recent publications include Native Plant Gardening for Quick Guide to Northern California Wildflowers, and a kid-oriented nature workbook, Backyard Science and Discovery Workbook for California. He received a master's in botany and zoology from the University of Texas, Austin. As a journalist, he specialized in conservation issues, outdoor recreation, and native plant subjects. He has written 25 nature guidebooks and published in numerous newspapers and magazines, including Wildflower, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and New Mexico Magazine Plant of the Month, Living Bird, and National Parks Traveler. George does have a presentation for us this evening, so make sure that you are on full screen so you can see the beautiful pictures that he has for you today. He'll be sharing his screen with all of us shortly. Again, please feel free to put any of your questions or comments into the chat box at any time. I will ask them for you once we get to that portion of the event. And then towards the end of that, if you're not able to access the chat box, I'll open it up for anybody who wants to ask their question live and in person. Until then, please do keep yourselves muted, and I will go ahead and do the same and let George take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be able to give the presentation to you. This is something the subject is something that's been near and dear to my heart for a number of years, number of decades, actually. Before I actually get into the slides, I want to start with the prologue. And as you can see, the prologue is gardening in times of climate change, water crisis, polar vortexes, pandemics, and the sixth extinction. Sort of the whole purpose of this series of books I've written on native plant gardening for birds, bees, and butterflies is to call attention to the insect apocalypse and what we can do to help solve some of the problems. As you can see on the screen, 80% of flowering plants need insects for pollination. The others are usually wind pollinated plants and other various types of pollination. Biologists have, in a number of studies, have determined that a 30% loss of a species, of the species numbers, will destabilize the population of that species and have a cascading effect up the food chain that affects all species. Well, the insect apocalypse, I would be almost certain that a number of you've heard of this and read about it. It's been quite a bit of attention in some of the popular newspapers and magazines, but it's not something that we're predicting. It's something that is here and has been here. Here's some facts that may be alarming to you. They are to me. 50% global decline in insect population since 1990. That was in the newspaper yesterday. Monarch butterfly numbers have dropped 90% since 1990. And that's a loss of 600 million butterflies. Flying insect numbers have dropped 82% in Germany, and insect numbers have dropped 45% in Britain. These are long-term studies that were carried out, over a 10 or 15-year period. Insect diversity in Holland has dropped 80%. And as a result of all that, farmland birds in Europe have dropped, the numbers have dropped 50%. And we can attribute all this primarily to habitat loss, to pesticides, to monoculture, herbicides. But what's alarming now is that in Puerto Rico, in the virgin rainforest there, the arthropod biomass has dropped 60-fold. That means that for every 60 ounces of insects weight in 1990, there's only 1 ounce there today. And this is in an area that's a pristine virgin rainforest with no human interference, no pesticides, no herbicides, no habitat loss. It's just strictly been attributed to climate change. Tropical ecosystems are very sensitive to shifts in the temperature regime, and that's what we're getting in climate change in the around the world. So let's start talking about pollinator-friendly landscapes. And there's been, with all the attention in recent years about the rapid decline of insect and pollination and pollinator populations, there have been a number of efforts to create and preserve pollinator habitat. And it's become a nationwide initiative. National and state governments and regional water authorities and groups like Bee City USA have created festivals, celebrations, pollinator day festivals and education programs. The National Wildlife Federation and the Xerces Society have backyard certification programs to certify habitats as pollinator friendly. State agencies and native plant societies sponsor workshops and classes and certification programs for yards. So the efforts to create urban habitat for birds, bees, and butterflies requires actually a new way to think about landscaping. It's not new, but it's for some people it is. Certainly for developers, it seems to be new. Insect-friendly yards require more than just a couple of beautiful shrubs, native shrubs, or maybe native flowers. That requires the thinking of a new paradigm of creating a habitat. And a habitat supplies all the needs that a pollinator would have, not just for flying in or buzzing in and getting some nectar and some water and going on, but the needs to create a sustainable population of pollinators. So what is the role of native plants in this instead of just using water-wise exotics? A lot of water agencies put out lists of water-wise plants, and a lot of times half of them are exotics. And the original purpose, when I first wrote my first landscape book on the Southwest in the 1980s, the big emphasis was saving water. And that's still a critical issue. We're in more of a drought now than we have been in the last 1,000 years. So I was trying to prevent the loss of water and create a frugal use of water is one of the initiatives of the Native Plant Societies, of the Native Plants and the Native Plant Society. Agriculture uses about 70% of the water, of our water usage, and that leaves the rest of it for municipal usage, for industry, extraction industries, for all the other uses. When you look at what it takes to produce a 1/4 pound beef patty, and if you start really from the planting of alfalfa and corn to raising a cow to, the feedlots and slaughterhouses and food preparation and transportation to grocery stores, it comes up an astounding 2,900 gallons of water for a quarter-pound patty. A glass of milk takes 150 gallons. A glass of wine takes 66 gallons. So of the 55% of urban water that goes to landscapes, by cutting down that use, we can have water in reserve for some of the things that we need water for, that we really are critical. Another hand-in-hand purpose for using natives is low maintenance, and that's the common sense understanding that a plant that has lived for 1,000 years in an area is much more adapted to it than one that's just brought in from somewhere else in the world. And so there's less expense in replacing and the upkeep of natives. Also, there's the idea of creating a sense of place. Lady Bird Johnson, when she created the National Wildflower Center, now the Lady Bird Wildflower Center, is famous for saying that she wanted Texas to look like Texas and Florida to look like Florida. Well, there's some common sense there too, that as we start to embrace our environment more and become more familiar with the plants that have been here for thousands of years, we feel more of an attachment and appreciation for the value of the environment around us. There's no reason why walking down the street, we shouldn't be able to see the same plants that the ancestral people that lived here for thousands of years used for their daily sustenance and food and fiber and ceremonial and everything else. It was the basis of their society. And we can still use those same plants today in our landscapes. But I think in the last 10 or 20 years, really the issue that's come up is repairing the environment and restoring the habitat. Because as our population has increased and our cities have enlarged in size, then there's been a tremendous loss of habitat. So we want to restore native pollinator populations. The key to that is native plants, because at some point in the life cycle of most native bees and flies and moths and beetles and hummingbirds and many other native animals, native plants are an important part of that life cycle, particularly in butterflies and bees that depend on native plants for their caterpillars. And unfortunately, many neighborhoods are dominated by exotic plants that contribute very little to the native animal populations. Exotics replace the plant communities that have evolved together for thousands of years, since the last ice age. In nature, plants developed complex associations with the wind and the rain and the wildfires and the blazing summers and freezing winters, even the soil organisms, bacteria and fungi in the soil. And plants put all this together, starting from 100 million years ago. And when you put all these together, you get a plant. You get the living representation of all these elements. And then about 150 million years ago, a new actor came on the stage that forever changed the wildflowers and the course of the history of plants on the earth, and that was pollinators. And the first pollinators in the fossil record date back 150 years ago to beetles. And then about 50 million years after that, we start seeing bees and butterflies and other pollinators in the fossil records. So from that point, the pollinators and the insects and the flowers all started evolving together, started co-evolving and changed the whole course of evolution for both plants and pollinators. Well, then not long after that, or not long after now, I should say, in the last 50 years or 100 years, a new player has come on the scene that's forever changed and altered the landscape of the world, and that's human development. So now we have a situation where we have, like in the California Florida province, has the greatest biodiversity in North America, with 3,388 species of flowering plants have been recorded. And a number of these have very high quality for landscaping. They have ornamental flowers, showy flowers, ornamental leaves, bark, interesting shapes and colors. And by incorporating those in our yard, then we are starting to repair some of the damage done by our own houses. Landscapes with that use 50% natives typically qualify for most of the programs as native habitat landscapes. So we can repair the environment one yard at a time. And the reason that we're able to do that is because as our houses were built and much of the landscape was destroyed, the plants were bulldozed away, the associations that had been living for thousands of years disappeared, and many of the complex communities of plants and animals were replaced by communities of houses and concrete streets and turf yards or gravel yards or yards that were inhospitable to the native animals. So what reason that we can do this one yard at a time is that wildlife live in what biologists call a patchy environment. That means that they have to forage around, and sometimes over large areas, to find a small patch of flowers or a seep spring or a tree that has the right caterpillars on it. And as they're looking for their food sources, many of them what they find may not be much larger than our backyards or front yards. And so by creating a place with a habitat, we can get some of these birds and bees and butterflies and other pollinators to stop and make our yards a regular stop on their foraging routes. So really, it's true that if we plant it, they will come. And what we need to do to establish our backyard oasis is to provide water, food, shelter, nest sites, and host plants. And in the past, people have been satisfied with providing water and food, bird feeders or hummingbird feeders and a bird bath. Then realize that, well, shelter is necessary too, because animals have to have a place to hang out during the heat of the day or when it's windy or when they're not foraging to be protected from predators. And so shelter was added. And then to really separate our habitats from the ephemeral temporary stops that a foraging butterfly may make, is if we can have host plants and nest sites for birds so that they can establish a sustainable population. And there are a lot of well, I'll go to the next one here. The water feature is really the anchor of any oasis. And the drier the area, the drier the habitat, the more important a water feature is. This is an elaborate one here. It doesn't have to be that fancy. This is a fountain, solar powered fountain that I got from the internet. And it has a little pump here that's connected to a solar panel, and the water goes up this tube and then trickles down again. And birds love the sound of gurgling water. And the bottom basin here is just about right size for a robin, and the smaller ones for finches and smaller birds. But really nothing beats a bird bath. A lot of birds are social, and house sparrows and other birds will gather in here, and besides drinking and take social baths. It's like hot tub time. I've had at least 10 robins at a time lined up around the bird bath here, drinking from it at the communal pub, I guess. Bees, as opposed to birds, bees like still water. So a dish with some pebbles in it for them to land on and filled with water is perfect for bees. And this can be something that's just have a drip emitter, or you go out with a hose every couple of days to fill up. Also, baby birds, and I'll see the baby bird here that's in my yard that hops over and drinks from the dish also. So we have running water for birds, still water for bees, and butterflies like moist soil, and they get their water and even some nutrients from the moist soil. And you can do this with just if you have a drip system, a emitter around a plant, or a mackerel spray for a garden, or just the overflow and the splash from a bird bath. So using these three sources of water will supply the needs of most pollinators. Of course, food is something that's really important that takes most of our attention, and diversity here is the key. If we want a diverse numbers and diverse type of pollinators, then we need a variety of plants, plant sizes and plant shapes in our yard. And when we do this, and when we choose plants that bloom throughout the seasons, throughout the year, we end up with a beautiful colorscape in our yard, as well as something that provides food for pollinators for most of the year. Shelter is really quite important. And again, with this, diversity is important also. The diversity of height, from shrubs to a medium-sized tree, to perennials, wildflowers, these all provide different shelters for different animals. Bees, solitary bees, most of them are native bees are solitary, and they either nest in bare ground, they'll burrow into a bare ground, so we need some areas that have no cover, or they'll burrow into a dead tree or wood or a branch or under the bark. So bee hotels have become real popular. This is a fairly elaborate one here. I have one hanging on my in my backyard that's just about the size of a birdhouse, and has a variety of hole sizes, hole diameters in it. And a week after I hung it up, a bee moved in and nested in one of them. And the bees will gather pollen and nectar and make a ball, and they'll put it in the chamber, lay an egg on it, and then seal it over, and then make another chamber, another egg chamber, and seal that over until they get 4 or 5 in a burrow or a hole in wood. So like I said, pollination has started 150 million years ago, and that's just more time than the human mind can comprehend. but there's really been a saga developed, and it's all about pollinator, plants manipulating pollinator behavior. And actually it comes as vice versa too. There's a coevolution, but it all centers around pollen and nectar. These are the engines that drive pollinators. And nectar is developed for energy and pollen for the protein. And but not all nectar is equal and not all pollen is equal. As more studies, a lot of this is just in the infancy of scientific studies, but more studies on nectar are discovering a lot of micronutrients in nectar. And some of these they've determined are critical for specific pollinators to be able to complete their life cycle. And other ones are strictly there to manipulate the pollinators, like caffeine. Members of the coffee family produce caffeine in their nectar so that the bees that fly in get a little extra buzz and are a lot more active and can pollinate more flowers. And then there are other flowers like the Datura that's in my book, and it produces an hallucinogenic, addictive pollen and nectar so that the pollinators will not only have a little happy trip when they visit, but they'll be addicted and come back over and over and over again. So this sounds like something going on the street corner, not in the corner of your garden, with these substances that the pollinators that the plants are producing. And then there are other micronutrients that plants use that are included in their pollen. And there's one that is a toxin to prevent herbivores from eating the plant. And the queen butterfly feeds on one of these plants, takes the nectar and metabolizes it and creates a pheromone, a perfume that the males use to attract the females. So with queen butterflies, the females are the ones that are attracted to perfume. And then when they mate, the male passes some of the unadulterated toxin to the female, and she incorporates it into the eggs that she lays on milkweeds. And then the eggs now are poison, and predators avoid them. There are a lot of wasps and other predators that eat eggs. And then when the eggs hatch into caterpillars, the caterpillars eat the milkweeds, and the latex in that part gives them a toxin that protects them from being eaten by birds. So we can see how complex this whole idea of pollination has developed. And that's just probably one of the simple pathways that we know about. There's a lot more out there that we don't know about. And it's the same story for pollen. Some plants have very rich, nutritious pollen, and some have just very poor, barely viable pollen at all. And some plants, the common dayflower will have 3 stamen with really big, showy, yellow pollen on it, but it's not worth anything. And then below that, it'll have 3 stamen with bluish, because it's a blue flower, bluish pollen on it that's the rich pollen that is used for fertilization. So when the bee lands on the flower, it gets and crawls up towards the big billboards that say, "Come here." It crawls over these other anthers, and as a result, the flower gets to only have to produce half as much pollen as it would necessarily produce, because only 3 of the pollen anthers have pollen on them that are viable. So this is a very tricky, very complex situation in evolving rewards for pollen and nectar that the flowers have developed. So we can use some of these strategies that flowers have developed in designing our habitat gardens. And so we can get as much diversity and as animals and have as a rich resource for animals that we can. Again, diverse plants means diverse animals, and by choosing the plants that bloom all through the year, we can have 3 to 4 seasons of food sources. There are two broad strategies that pollination strategies that plants use. One is to be a generalist, to attract everybody that's interested in nectar and pollen. It's like the nectar bar and the pollen buffet are open for all and everybody's welcome. And then, the classic example of this is a sunflower. And it produces lots and lots of pollen, lots and lots of nectar, and lots of animals come in and feast on it that don't have anything to do with their pollination. They have no way to pollinate another sunflower. So a large percentage of that food and energy they produce goes to animals that are not pollinating them. So to on the opposite scale, to save energy that is used for producing pollen and nectar, there are plants that are specialists, and they attract only pollinators that are a certain size or have a certain length tongue or have certain type of hair on their bodies. These are the RSVP, by invitation only, plants. So their strategy is to save energy, but attracting only a certain type or certain class of insects. So generalist plants are really popular for gardens for the simple reason that they come in all colors and shapes and sizes, and they attract a diversity of pollinators. And aster families are some of the favorite of all the garden plants are available, most effective in a pollinator garden. Buckwheats are really critical. They're a major pollinator in a garden. And milkweeds, they have a place in the pollinator garden for sure. I'll talk about them later. They are very generalist in producing nectar. They just have ample nectar in their flowers, but they're very frugal with the pollen, and only a very few insects can actually pollinate the milkweeds. So plants specialize by altering their shape and color and size. Long tubular plants like the Datura and penstemons have the nectar down at the base. The nectar glands are down at the base, so that the insect or the hummingbirds have to somehow get down into there to reach it. So with a Datura, it has a long 4 or 5 inch sometime tube, and Sphinx moths are able to have long enough tongues to reach all the way down to the base of the tube. And when they do that, their head gets down into the throat of the flower, gets pollen all over them from the anthers. And then as they go up and down, sipping, they get, the stigma gets pollen transferred to it. This is in my yard. And when I go out in the morning, when it's still cool to get the newspaper, I still read newspapers. There'll be honeybees and native bees all around here too, getting the pollen. So they're sort of a late entry into the scene here, because the flower is going to fold up by the heat of the day, by mid-morning, and they are able to pick up some of the pollen before it does that. And penstemons, I'll talk about them and how they are adapted more in a moment, but the size of the tube determines how large a bee can get inside, crawl inside the tube and get back to where the nectar is. So penstemons come in all colors and diameters, depending on what their target pollinator is. So some specialized plants that are very popular for garden use are penstemons. Like I said, they come in all shapes and sizes. The mint and sage family, all the way from the garden kitchen mints, kitchen herbs that you have in a kitchen garden, all the way to the beautiful sages and other members of the mint and sage family. And beans, the legumes, have little narrow tubular flowers that attract insects that have longer tongues. With the constellation of characteristics that a plant has developed to attract a particular type or particular class of pollinators is called a syndrome. And syndromes, you can look at a plant and see whether quite often what pollinates it, if you're familiar with the type of syndrome. Now, this isn't sealed in cement or anything. Insects don't read the biological journals. So if they can find a way to get pollen and nectar, they will. But in general, let's talk about some pollination syndromes. And hummingbird syndrome is red flowers, red tubular flowers. They don't have any odor because hummingbirds can't smell. They don't have nectar lines, but they have a long tube that is just a little longer than the hummingbird bill. So when the hummingbird sticks its bill in down to the bottom to where the nectaries are, the plants usually will have the stamens and anthers protruding out beyond the throat. And so the head of the hummingbird will rub against and get dusted with pollen, and then take it to the next plant. And you can see that on this sage, the sticking out there, both the stamens and the stigma. There's the stamens and there's the stigma. So when the hummingbird sticks its head all the way in, it'll get pollen on its nose, and then its head will also impact against the stigma and pollination will occur. Bee pollination syndrome. This is even more complex. Bees are the #1 pollinator in the world, the most important pollinators in the world. And tubular flowers that are blue and yellow are usually keyed in to bees. That's the colors that bees recognize as a source of food. They have usually it will have a landing pad on the front of the petal. Some petals will be developed as a landing pad so that the bee can land on that and then crawl inside to get to the nectary at the base of the throat. Nectar lines, darker lines, will act like runway lights, will guide the insect into the into the throat of the flower. Now you can see the inflated tube here. That's sized for bumblebees. So this particular penstemon is pollinated by bumblebees, and the bumblebee crawls in, and these anthers will dust pollen on its back, and then when it dips down to get to sip nectar, there's the stigma right here, and it'll rub against his back and transfer pollen from other flowers. Now this real hairy throat here, or hairy, is called, penstemons are also called beard tongues because one of the stamens is sterile and grows lots of hairs. That's thought probably to keep smaller insects from landing here that are too small to reach up for their backs to rub against the anthers. There's a lot going on here too, besides just this complex system of pollination. A lot of plants will have sticky hairs and glands all over from their leaves, their stems, the flower buds, and the flower petals. And these will deter ants from crawling up and getting inside the flower and stealing the nectar. So there's a lot. When we have pollinating, when we have plants in our backyard, there's really a lot going on there that is not necessarily obvious when we're looking at it. We can see the color and the beauty of the flower, but there's really a complex system at work there. The fly pollination syndrome, and maybe you haven't thought about planting your garden to attract flies, but flies are the second most important pollinators in the world. They're active over a wider temperature range than bees. So in cooler climates or higher latitudes or higher elevations, flies are really important pollinators. You can tell a fly from a bee by looking at their face. Flies have a very large hemispheric eye that takes up almost half their head. That's one thing that's easily seen, but also their antennas. Flies have real stubby antennas. Bees have long antennas, and that's very evident when you look at them. Flies have 2 wings and bees have 4 wings, but that's really tough to see when they come flying by. And beetles, as I mentioned, they're the first known pollinators. They haven't changed much through the years, through the millions of years. They got something pretty good going for them, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So they just sort of rummage around across the flower, eating their way through the petals, through the pollen, through the rest of the flower. And as they do that, they get covered with pollen. You can see how much pollen they get on this blanket flower, and they've really chewed up the petals. And quite often they'll feed in mass. There'll be dozens of beetles on one flower or one group of flowers. Like goldenrods, the goldenrod beetle, maybe a dozen on one stem of flowers. And butterflies, well, there's not really a butterfly syndrome because butterflies are not really efficient pollinators. And you can see that here on this coneflower. The butterfly's long legs, it's standing up above the little tubular disc florets here, and he's dipping down with his tongue. A little pollen on his tongue, if you can see that, but no pollen on his body. They don't have hairs designed to collect and hold pollen. A thistle is a little more efficient here with butterflies. It has stamen that stick way up and it contact the butterfly when it flies in and sticks its tongue down into the heart, the base of the flowers here. And the stigmas all at this level will probably get impacted by the butterfly. You can see it's covered with pollen, and see pollen on his legs, pollen on his tongue. So it's probably pretty efficient in pollinating thistles. And there is the leopard lily, which is one of the prize flowers of Northern California. And they are pollinated specifically by swallowtails, butterflies. So they're designed to be pollinated by butterflies. Moth pollination is another. Moths are really important, and you can pick out a moth pollinated flower usually because it's white or it's light pink, something that shows up in the moonlight. Moth flowers are aromatic. They release a lot of pheromones and perfumes to attract moths from a long distance. And their bloom period, their bloom time during the day corresponds with the pollinator activity. So that's usually at night or somewhat crepuscular. They're active, moths are active at dusk and at dawn so flowers like the evening primrose and the 4 o'clock family will open up in the late afternoon and be open all night and then stay open until the heat of the morning and fade, usually bloom for only one day. I'll just go back and say that having a moon garden has become interesting that some people have planted small areas where they have a number of plants that bloom at night just for the purpose of attracting moths. And the classic moth for that is the Sphinx moth, or the hawk moth, that is active from evening until the next morning. There have been tracking hawk moths, and found that one single moth can cover 10 square miles of area pollinating evening primroses. It's to the mutual benefit of flowers and of the pollinator for conserving energy. The flower wants to conserve energy and get as much pollination as it can. And the pollinator wants to conserve energy traveling and buzzing around to get its food. So flowers often bloom in clusters. And this way, a pollinator can land and feed on 10, 20, 30 little florets at a time without having to buzz around all over the meadow trying to find one flower at a time. So they're round and flat-topped flowers, clusters, that allow the pollinators to pollinate, to gather their food with a minimal amount of energy of flying around. Another strategy are spikes, and that's flowers on a stem like this, and they'll quite often start blooming at the bottom and gradually bloom up to the top, so that you can see on this specimen, you can see the buds haven't opened up there yet. So that way one stem can be blooming and producing flowers and nectar and pollen for a week or two at a time. Some go a little farther to make it more efficient by just having flowers on one side of the stem. And that way the hummingbird or the bumblebee can just move up and down and not have to circle around and round and round. So let's talk for a minute about a planting guide for plants that will provide pollinators with food and shelter throughout the seasons. And we're lucky in Northern California that have a long extended blooming time for a lot of plants. Well, in the early spring, when the bees first start emerging from their nesting burrows, the nursery chambers, they're hungry. And a lot of plants perhaps haven't been triggered by the warming weather and haven't germinated their seeds. Well, it's a good thing we have shrubs, because shrubs don't have to germinate. They don't have to grow a root system. They don't have to grow branches and leaves. They're all set. They're ready to go. So as soon as some are triggered by the winter moisture and bloom, some are triggered by the warming spring weather and bloom, but they have their buds already formed, and so they just have to pop open when they're triggered. And you can, combine that with some spring annuals, and you'll have a nice color combination. But by having early blooming plants, then when the bees emerge, then they're something there for them to eat, and something there for the hummingbirds that are resident to have all winter long too. So there are a lot of wonderful plants, shrubs, that will bloom, have a long blooming season, like the ceanothus, the manzanitas, and some others that we'll mention. Then there's the plants that will have both spring pollen, which satisfy butterflies and bees, but then they'll have summer berries or summer fruit, and it's perfect for the birds. So chokecherry is an interesting small tree, shrub to small tree, that does provide a 3 seasons supermarket full of food. Golden currant and all the other currants are also have that be able or able to provide both spring nectar and pollen and summer berries for birds and other small animals. Woolly blue curls is a wonderful plant. Look at, I love the bizarre looking flowers that they have. They bloom, are long blooming shrubby plant that provides several seasons worth of nectar and pollen. And I think some of these that I'm showing are going to be in the Native Plant Society, Napa Valley Native Plant Society plant sale next month. Another spring and summer pollen and nectar source are monkey flowers, bush monkey flowers. And you can get those in this beautiful orange, reddish, and yellow flowers, but they're a sizable shrub that has a long blooming season. Another spring nectar and fall fruit is the California coffee berry, and they have evergreen foliage, so they provide a source of shelter all throughout the year and a source of color for your garden throughout the year. Like verbena is a wonderful source of spring to fall, almost year round nectar and pollen. That's also will be, I understand, will be in the native plant sale. I want to talk for a moment about milkweeds. Milkweeds are really summer pollinator magnets. They produce copious amounts of nectar, which everything that has the least bit of liking for nectar is going to be attracted to, but they're really bizarre flowers. And if you look at the flowers, the sepals bend way back just to get out of the way of the traffic on the flowers. And if you look down at this one, the petals are these little modified, they're called hoods. They're modified and they have the nectar down at the base of them. So that's just wide open. Anybody can come in, short tongue, long tongue, whatever, and sip from the nectar. And they produce a lot of it. But then we get a little more, it gets a little more complex. Also modified petals are the horns. And the horns arc over, in most species, arc over the central column, which contains the stamens and the stigmas. So the stamens produce a little package of pollen. And you can see the package of pollen here on this Carpenter Bee. They're little wings, little Y-shaped wings. They each have 40 or 50 grains of pollen on it. And they're this little little yellow spot here is where they're stuck into the column. And then when the bee's legs rub against it, they snare off and pull out that pollen, the pollen package. Now the shape here of the hood and the horns means that the bees have to kind of put their foot down in between here. And when they do that, then they rub against the central column and pull out the pollen area. And when it comes out, it's straight like this. And then as it dries, it hooks and becomes parallel. And then when they step on another flower, it rubs against this column and there's a little slot in there that it slips into and breaks off. So you can see one of these is already broken off. These two haven't dried yet and reoriented themselves. So this is just a bizarre pollination technique. I'm at a loss of words to figure out how something like this can be efficient, but it certainly is, because you look at the seed pods on a milkweed and they're just filled with these fluffy seeds that float all over. Seed dispersal is a whole nother ball game that plants have developed. Okay. Continuing, penstemons are great pollinator magnets all summer long. They attract, some of them will attract big bees, little bees, flies, and the red ones will attract hummingbirds. And it's all dependent on the size of this tube here. The foothills penstemon is these gorgeous colors of blue, and the scarlet bugler, large clumps and large stems of red flowers. These are drought tolerant. These grow in the desert, really desert dry conditions, and these in the foothills. Another important summer source that extends into the fall are buckwheats, goldenrod, and coyote mint. And this is really important. The fall, pay particular attention to the fall flowering plants, because as the bees are getting near the time when they go into winter hibernation, or they're seal up their nesting burrows for the winter, they need a lot of pollen. They need pollen for and nectar to create the nectar balls that are the food source for their larvae. And then in the winter, when the larvae will hatch and eat the nectar balls.
It's 9 o'clock.
And go through a full metamorphosis, just like butterflies and moths do. I wondered if you took a poll of all the bees and butterflies and birds in the pollinators garden, what plant would be their favorite? And I think that the annual sunflower would be near the top of the list, if not the top. This is a window box with, and they're fall blooming, late summer, fall blooming. This maybe has 5 or 10 stems in it. Each stem has 5 or 10 branches, and each branch has a big flower head on it. And you can see the flower head here. It starts blooming from the end and progressively blooms toward the center, and these buds haven't opened yet. So it has 30 or 40 florets, disc florets that are blooming. You can see the pollen on them, and the bumblebee getting nectar from it and gathering pollen. So if in this one window box, I counted like 30 or 40 flower heads. Each one will have 30 or 40 disc florets in it at any one time over a month period. So, there are more than 1,000 flowers blooming here at any one time, and producing 1,000 seeds for seed-eating birds, which they can't eat that many. So sunflower is a very prolific self-seeder. So if you can put a sunflower in the back corner of your yard, you'll soon have an oval garden or a separate garden, or you'll have a forest of them very soon. And the birds and the bees and the butterflies will all thank you. So once you start seeing caterpillars in your yard, you've got starting to get a balanced ecosystem. You have a healthy habitat that's going to be a year-round support for your pollinators. Caterpillars are important because 95% of the songbirds need caterpillar protein in order to successfully raise their nestlings. And a lot of this comes from trees that have moths in it. Some moths will have up to 30 or 40 species of caterpillars nibbling away at the leaves. The birds feast on these, and a lot of their nesting is synchronized with the caterpillar hatch. So there's this very close synchrony of birds and caterpillars and butterflies, and they're laying their eggs on the synchrony of flowers and insects. And if that gets out of sync because of blooming times change due to climate change, then everything starts getting wobbly. So we all can become backyard botanists and landscape ecologists by starting our own pollinator habitats in our yards. National Wildlife will give you a sign to put, and some of the other organizations that you have made a conscious effort to try to support and to reestablish some of the habitat was lost by our development. Because really, restoring lost habitat is very important, even if it's just at one driveway at a time. So that concludes my talk. I hope you've had a chance to look at my new book. I also have this book on wildflowers of Northern California. It's a pocket guide that has a list for 248 species with just a small picture and a description that's really nice for going in backpacks and purses and back pockets when you're out and about. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. So this, I guess, ends my talk. I appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you so much, George. Do you want to stop your screen share? And as folks, perfect. And as folks think of any questions they have, which you can put in the chat box, everyone, I'm going to invite Henny Cohen, who happens to be my mother, but is also the president of the Napa chapter of the California Native Plant Society, just for a little brief chat about their upcoming plant sale, native plant sale. And you're on mute right now, Mom.
There you go. Well, I really enjoyed first reading George's book. It's a wonderful resource for those of us who are interested in native plants and in pollinators. Thank you, George, for writing it. And it is also a wonderful guide for us in the Native Plant Society, as I am working to provide plants for the local community as we promote having wonderful native plants for pollinators, and also to help promote low water use plants. Our plant sale will have many of the plants that you have mentioned. We'll have a number of different varieties of ceanothus and manzanitas of varying sizes. We'll have lots of yarrows and monkey flowers. I always refer to yarrows and lilac verbenas as butterfly landing pads. I think that describes what they're, how they look when they attract those butterflies. We will have coffee berries. I have tried to put together a wide variety of plants. The sale is May 21st and 22nd at Skyline Park from 10 o'clock until 4 p.m. both days. And we also are propagating a number of the plants that we will have there. Plants like the coyote bush, the dwarf coyote bush, and lupins, and lilac verbena, and the foothill penstemon. So we will be there to help people find the right plants for the right space, because not all of us have bright sunny yards, and some of us have lots of shade, and native plants do create a habitat for both shade loving and sun loving insects as well. So thank you, George, for the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope if you have a chance, can come by sometime and see the native plant garden in Skyline Park. That's been there for 35 years.
Oh, great. I'd love to see that.
Well, let me know, and I'll be happy to give you a tour.
You bet.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mom, for saying that. And I put links in the chat for anyone who hasn't purchased the book yet, and also to the CNPS website and the newsletter about the upcoming plant sale for more info. Nobody has yet put anything in the chat box as a question. So I'm going to say, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question in person, you are more than welcome to do so at this time. I'm going to give it just a little bit to see if anybody unmutes before we let George go, since it is later where you are, George, right? You're an hour ahead of us.
Right.
Okay, well, nobody's popping on. And I think that goes to show just how thorough and informative your talk was. I feel like I learned a lot, which is really cool. And I love that. That's my favorite kind of book event, when I learn a lot. So with that being said, George, is there anything you'd like to end with?
Well, just thank you for this opportunity to share my book with you, and I'm glad to be able to talk.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Henny Cohen, my mom, for popping on to talk about CNPS and the plant sale. We do still have copies of the book in the store. We can ship domestically if you are gardening from afar, or if you have friends that you want to send it to, or if you want it for your own perusal. Or we do have a copy of the Southern California book, also by George, and we can get any of his other books as well. Thank you all so much. We have a couple. Gwen says thanks and Liz says thanks, George, just in case you didn't see those. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and that we see you at a future.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I have a website that has over 650 plants, descriptions, and identification tips for mainly for plants of the Southwest. It also includes a lot of, of course, of California. So the website for that is real easy to remember. It's Wildflowers NM, New Mexico, wildflowersnm.com. And so if you can see that, and it has a lot of identification tips that can help people identify, and a little more information about a lot of the plants that are actually included in this book too, because we have a lot of altitude plants that occur in California. So I welcome people to check out the website.
Perfect. And I just dropped that in the chat as well. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. We hope to see you at a future Napa Book Mine event. We hope to see you at the California Native Plant Society sale on May 21st and 22nd. And I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you again, George.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.